Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council World Affairs Today program. Tonight we turn to the subject of the developing United States role on the international scene and the ongoing discussion of what America's role might be in the coming decades, how the United States will relate to other nations, and what will be the implications for and impact on Americans as well as many other nations in the world, including our traditional friends and allies. Our speaker is Michael Moran, author of the just published book, The Reckoning: Debt, Democracy, and the Future of American Power. Mr. Moran is an international affairs analyst, digital documentarian, and director, editor-in-chief of Renaissance Insights, a geoeconomic analysis wing of the investment bank Renaissance Capital. Previously, he served as vice president and executive editor and senior geostrategic analyst at the Rubini Global Economics, the macro strategy consultancy founded by the economist Nouriel Roubini. He also spent 4 years as executive director of CFR.org, the website of the Council on Foreign Relations. During that time, he was the founding editor of the Crisis Guides documentary series. He led a team that earned Emmy Awards for the interactive multimedia guides for the crisis in Darfur and for business and financial coverage. In 2011, he received an Overseas Press Club Award for his crisis guide on Pakistan. He is well known for his years at MSNBC, where he wrote the foreign policy column Brave New World. There, he broke the story about the inadequate armor of American Humvees, which, along with the ensuing protest by service parents, resulted in the Pentagon back-armoring the vehicles. Tonight, he will discuss the New World Order evolving as he explores how a variety of forces are converging to challenge U.S. leadership in the world and how some of the various scenarios for U.S. reaction and engagement might play out. Please join me in welcoming Michael Moran.
Thank you very much. Very honored to be here. I've had the opportunity to see a number of World Affairs Councils in the last few weeks, and it's just a wonderful thing to see people turning out on a nice day, too early in the season really, to listen to someone speak about the world and think about and discuss with you where we're going as a nation and where the world sees us. I was very fortunate in my career to have really begun to come into my own as a journalist at a moment when the United States really was at its peak in terms of influence and power. I was posted to Germany. It was actually West Germany at the time, just as the wall came down. And I was working for Radio Free Europe, which I was one of the young kind of Turks there who had actually reported that the institution had previously been confined to reading tea leaves and interviewing with dissidents who had come back from Eastern Europe, and then trying to broadcast back into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. As soon as I got there, suddenly the wall came down, and one after another, we were able to actually go and do what I did best, at the time was be a reporter in these countries. And so I knew firsthand that your blue passport and a pack of Marlboros would get you to the presidential palace in Prague. It was just a moment of amazing, wasn't victory, it was the wrong word. It was euphoric. U.S. was really the recipient of a great deal of goodwill in the world. And to this day, they debate how and why in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and in China, too. This all came about in the way it came about. I really thought at the time, had no children, I thought my kids are going to grow up in a better world. This is a great place. It's a wonderful moment in history. And then, of course, I was in New York for 9/11 as well. And we have a way as humans of shattering the euphoria. I think that this began 9/11 and then the subsequent 2008 crisis that unfolded first in the U.S. and then overseas, began a process of acceleration of what would have been an inevitable and slower relative decline in the U.S. in terms of its hegemony in the world and ultimately its influence. We really did, in many ways, shoot ourselves in the foot pretty well twice within the first decade of this century. First, of course, in Iraq, which really did damage our national brand, because no matter how many mistakes we had made in the past, there was always this, among most, this sense that this is a country that doesn't deliberately do these things. This is a country that has, generally speaking, acted out of some form of higher principle, or at least, even if the more cynical people thought it was window dressing, generally speaking, the status quo power, the United States, acted in the interest of itself, but because of its dynamism, because of the way it was structured, the way it had created relationships with various powers and smaller countries across the world, that it, by definition, was somewhat benefiting the rest of the world when it was benefiting itself. That has changed, and I think we need to examine the extent to which the status quo and the kind of fetish for stability that the United States foreign policy and military establishment have is relevant. We now live in a time of transition, not stability. Stability doesn't necessarily benefit us. It's certainly not what the emerging powers of the world seek at the moment. They seek to overturn the American century. The last thing they want is to perpetuate it. Having said that, most of them will recognize that it was the United States that created the ecosystem that allowed them to emerge in the first place. There was nothing inevitable about China and India, South Korea, and various countries of in now what is regarded as the frontier markets in the financial world, the Nigerias, the South Africas, the countries that are now emerging as a second tier. There was nothing inevitable about their emergence from near destitution. And there was nothing really inevitable about Europe's recovery after World War II. These were things that the United States helped bring about and has done a very poor job of taking credit for properly. The U.S. should be very proud of the world it created, but it should recognize also that that world is passing slowly into history, and that the infrastructure that was designed in 1945 and roughly through the 60s that managed and attempted to govern this world really no longer fit the ambitions of the powers that are now emerging, or even the national interests of the United States. And this is where I think the book that I've just written attempts to take readers. We have a bit of a national denial problem. We are told from nearly the time we can read that we are exceptional in this nation, and I believe that to be true. But right now, the most exceptional thing is the extent to which we're in denial, I think, about the world that has been and the world that's coming. We act in the world as if it is our job to perpetuate the status quo balance of powers in various corners of the world and in financial markets. This is not necessarily either in our interest anymore, within our capability economically, nor is it necessarily the way to maintain peace. If you, throughout history, powers which or hegemonic powers particularly, which have overextended themselves to keep these vast intercontinental balance of power arrangements together, find that they become tremendously brittle and they break very quickly. It's stunning the extent, the speed that these things can change, historically speaking. I do also think that should we continue down this road, on the one hand, domestically, really failing to have the conversation we need to have about both our domestic entitlement programs and the extent to which we lavish money on the military and other priorities which might not be necessarily in balance with our current economic capability. On the other hand, continue to maintain relationships that are paternalistic in nature with countries which long ago should have been told to go deal with their own problems in terms of security. These are bluffs that are meant to be called, that should be called and haven't been called. And I'm talking about, obviously Europe. the idea that we still have 70,000 troops in Germany is, I just don't understand it. I've lived there. I lived there 3 years of my life at the end of the Cold War. Even then, it was hard to understand. But now it's just ridiculous, really. There are some very strong arguments for the logistical hubs that exist at Rhein-Main Air Base and Ramstein Hospital. Beyond that, though, this, having air bases in Denmark and the Netherlands and the UK, Spain, Italy, it goes on and on and on. And it's time to move home over there. Let them take care of it over there. We can't afford it anymore. I'd say the same thing in Asia. These are different issues. But in Asia, I think we've got two very interesting relationships with South Korea and with Japan, where they pay a very small stipend for it's what is essentially a subsidized national security policy. And they've never been asked really to pony up and pay for it themselves. The Japanese, of course, for historical reasons, have been able to say, well, of course, this is just self-defense for us. We would never do something like that. And South Korea, a much more legitimate issue. But does it make sense at this point to have 27,000 American troops within, artillery range of North Korea? Is that we are literally subsidizing a hostage policy? It's absurd. We will either come to their defense or we don't, but I don't think we need to put 27,000 American lives to prove it. And we don't need to pay for it. That's the issue. These are very expensive deployments. These are deployments which have outlived their usefulness and in many cases actually exacerbate troubles or stow trouble for the future. In Asia, for instance, I believe that there will always be factions within the Chinese and U.S. military establishments who have an absolute vested interest in painting the other as the enemy, as the evil, implacable enemy, which is absolutely bent on dominating the region. I think that is a disastrous course for us to follow. Unfortunately, the opportunistic nature of our relationships with these smaller East Asian nations, largely, tactically brilliant that we're moving in when China does something stupid in the South China Sea and reinforcing our ties with people like Vietnam and the Philippines. But strategically, is this really where we want to go? We want to ring China with little military relationships that literally prove the point that the hawks in China are making, that we've got to break out. We've got to change our military. We can't just be disruptive. We can't just be defensive anymore. We need to be able to project power because the U.S. is penning us in and trying to contain us and trying to thwart our rightful rise in the world. That's the way Chinese military thinkers are approaching this. I don't think it's a healthy thing to encourage that, and I don't think it's necessary. I think we, as the United States, which created the UN, which created the IMF, which created the World Bank, I'm being a little bit exaggerating here. Obviously the Europeans played a role. But it is in our enormous interest to begin to architect the post-American world so that it's not forced upon us. We should be thinking about what kind of multinational institution should exist in Asia so that Japan and South Korea and China can have a relationship instead of a rivalry. It doesn't have to be American-centric. Remember, each of those countries I just named, and you can add India and Vietnam and Australia to the list, have seen in the last 10 years their position, their trade partnership go from America in the dominant position to China. The writing's on the wall there. Their prosperity now depends on the Chinese economy. That's actually a good thing, as is our codependence with China. I would love to see our debt go down, and I'd love to see the Chinese have less leverage there, but they are really stuck with us. It's like a bad marriage, but there's a stasis there. It's not a completely bad thing. That creates an enormous barrier to serious problems militarily between us because their stakes are enormous for both economies, which is demonstrated in the last recession. Obviously, we focus on the damage that was done to our own economy in that recession, rightfully so. We, after all, did drive the truck off the cliff ourselves. The Chinese suffered seriously in that recession as well. Their economy is dependent on the idea of us and the Europeans buying their goods. This doesn't happen if we're in recession. So this is not something they want. So I worry that we are not having a series of important conversations, both with our allies and with the people who could potentially develop into really serious peer adversaries about the future, about how the future should be ordered, about what kind of norms should exist, about what is obsolete, the UN Security Council, possibly some aspects of the WTO. Do these things work anymore? Are they relevant to us? Do they really reflect reality in the world? Or should we be leading the effort to reform these institutions? Because if we don't do it, it will get done. Every week, I see a new indication that we have slipped. And I don't mean this to be very anti-American. I'm not in all a doomsayer. I think the United States is unique among some of the larger countries in the world in having both the intellect, the political system, and the demographic and economic potential to fix its problems and remain, if not hegemonistic, and then the most important single power in the world for many, many decades. We're not doing it, but we have the potential. We'll get to why in a moment. But what I do believe is an interesting development this week. You saw over the weekend, perhaps, that the Chinese have allowed their currency to move just a bit more within this band, now 1%. This sounds very small, and it certainly doesn't answer the criticism that they get from Washington, from both parties, really, that they should let it float and that it's the cause of all our ills, which is vast oversimplification of what's going on in our economy. But what I see here is another step away from a world which depends on the U.S. Treasury bill as the safe investment for countries that have surplus economies. That was something that went into high gear last year when we had that absurd debate over whether or not to default on our debts. If you were China, would you not want to see an alternative emerge to the U.S. Treasury bill if you had a faction in the United States Congress that actually thought it would have been good for us to default? I mean, that is just astounding to me. The markets and many people, mostly on the right, shrugged off the problem as if it didn't matter. See, it doesn't matter. They have no option. They have to buy T-bills. There are people all over this planet trying to figure out how to fix that problem, and they will. It's going to be a basket of currencies, the ruble, the yuan, who knows, maybe the euro, a few others that trade in some kind of an index, or it could be this thing called special drawing rights that the IMF uses to do certain transactions. But they will come up with an alternative because we have been irresponsible in our management of our own currency and our own economy. And that is ultimately, again, another thing that is accelerating what should be a slow, natural process of relative rising in some of the world and our relative decline. Decline shouldn't scare people. Decline is something that's been with us since 1945. After all, there were no economies at the end of World War II. I mean, I think you could categorize the Soviet Union's economy as functioning in some very narrow sense. It was awesome tank factory. Sweden you drop pretty far from Sweden, though. Everything else was in ruins. Relative terms, we were the game at that point. Canada as well. It's natural that relative decline take place. It doesn't have to be apocalyptic. It doesn't have to be that the United States feels defensive at a moment like this, but we do, and it shows in our attitude. It shows in the debate in our politics, which is very, very superficial on these issues. We have a very thin skin when it comes to the question of where the world is going and where is our place in it. As much as we profess to be for democracy, we take steps that clearly undermine it. And we could do ourselves a great favor by being a force for unraveling some of these unsustainable problems that will ultimately get unraveled in an uncontrolled way. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. Taiwan is, generally speaking, looked at as a country that exists largely because of the American security guarantees that are provided. It's very ambiguous deliberately, obviously, but Taiwan appears over the last 5 or 6 years to have understood that it needs to begin to hedge on this. You cannot live forever on a blank check written by a country who, when push comes to shove, are they really going to trade San Francisco for Taipei? I mean, this is a debate that goes on in Taiwan. The nationalist, ironically, the Nationalist Party is not the nationalists anymore in Taiwan, but the party that would like to have possibly declared independence doesn't like this talk, obviously, because it undermines the basic, front that Taiwan likes to has put on since Chiang Kai-shek, which is that we are China, we are separate, and that, well, we've agreed not to, to separate completely right now under duress, but essentially unification is off the table. That when the communists fall, then we'll go back victorious. I mean, this is the simplistic view of Taiwan. Recently, though, Taiwan has come to terms with the fact that the same facts that the rest of Asia has. Its economy and its prosperity depend enormously on the Chinese economy. One of the interesting things that happened in the last couple of years, and I was happy to hear that the World Affairs Council had actually a meeting on this topic. The election earlier this year in March, in which not only did the more moderate candidate win, which is good for the world in general, I think, but the Chinese government, for some reason, which we may never know why, allowed the election to be covered by Chinese media and allowed Chinese on the mainland to read Taiwan's websites during the campaign. This is a really interesting moment, because not only did it give Chinese mainlanders a view into the actual politics and debate in Taiwan, which was not about, in any way, about Chiang Kai-shek. It was a genuine view and debate about the future of the country, plus the mundane things that all democracies debate, taxes and business and various transportation bills. The other thing, though, that was interesting is that China's microblogs absolutely exploded in admiration of the debate that was going on among their fellow Chinese. After all, they've been told for decades that the reason they can't have democracies is because if they did, they would destroy the country. Chinese can't handle it. We're not prepared for democracy. This is the old historical dialectic. This is not that phase yet. Trust the Communist Party. We'll take care of you for a while. This destroyed that, and I don't know that the Communist Party thought it through when they lifted the curtain, but this is how the air gets out of the balloon in some of these countries. I find those kind of things very interesting, and I think we in the United States have a very monolithic view of China as this rival, as this looming threat to our way of life. And I rarely hear an American commentator point out that this is a country that which was legitimately ideologically 180 degrees from us less than 30 years ago, and has by and large been adopting all the things we've been proselytizing about for decades, one after another. And now, wouldn't it be ironic if Taiwan was actually the germ of democracy that ultimately infected China? Ultimately, Taiwan seems to understand that it needs to start talking about a future in which that divide disappears. First of all, there's too much political risk in allowing it to remain, because there's always the possibility that factions within China decide that it's in their interest to put on a show of force. And what better way to show the national mettle than finally retake Taiwan? That's a small risk, I think, but it's not going to go away unless they negotiate something. The other thing, though, is I think Taiwan has looked at the experience of Hong Kong and said, well, there were negotiations. There were supposed to be guarantees of democratic freedoms. But the British Empire, by the time it made these negotiations, had nothing, had no juice left in Asia. Basically, after the fall of Singapore in 1942, the British were through in Asia and the Chinese knew it. So by the time Thatcher sat down with the Chinese to talk about the future of Hong Kong, game was up. The Chinese accepted terms that gave Thatcher a face-saving way out, but then they did what they wanted. Taiwan knows this. Taiwan knows that time to negotiate is when you have some strength on your side. And Taiwan is a serious economy. It brings to the table financial know-how, it takes a serious issue off the international plate if China can figure out a way to do this right. And on top of that, the United States can actually shepherd this from a position of strength right now. I wouldn't be surprised. You've seen over the last 3 years that Taiwan signed an economic treaty with China. I wouldn't be surprised that they start to inch in the direction of some negotiations. It's too early to talk about publicly, but I think they're talking behind the scenes. Now transfer that whole scenario to the Middle East, where we have the Israelis pursuing policies that are increasingly out of step with the environment around them. The sea change in the Middle East right now really was the reactivation of what you might think of as the Western Front for Israel. Egypt, which had been taken off the table by Camp David for 30 years, is on the table now. It's a question mark. We don't know where Egypt is going. I don't think the Egyptians are in any mood to become a frontline state in the 1970s sense again. I don't think that's happening. But it's now a risk there. It's there. What's shocking, though, is that the Israelis have done nothing, really, to take advantage of the fact that the Palestinian issue is not the enormous center of emotional politics in the Arab world right now. The Arab world has just gone through a series of revolutions, small and large, which were about their own dignity, their own economic freedoms, their own tired weariness with the corruption of the elites that supposedly speak for them. The Israelis, this could be a huge opportunity for them to take advantage of it. And yet, in the middle of it, the Israelis have actually done the opposite. They've clammed up. They've gone into a security bunker. They've lost, because of some very ham-handed diplomacy, their most important ally in the Middle East, Turkey. I don't think that's unsalvageable, but they have really mishandled that relationship at exactly the wrong time. This is the best possible outcome for Israel, that Turkey becomes more influential in the Middle East, not the worst possible outcome. I mean, there are plenty of others that would be much worse. And then on top of that, you know, there is a rift with the United States over Iran. I think this is a country that is not being well served by the United States right now. The United States should be having difficult conversations with Taiwan. We should be having the difficult conversation with the Israelis. They need to strike a deal while they're in a position of strength. Over the next 20 years, as democracy takes root in the Arab world, the foreign policies of the Arab states will have to be responsive to public opinion. That was never true before. It was manipulated, it was whipped up sometimes, but Egypt was set, you know, they sat on Egypt's public opinion for 30 years and nothing happened. That's not going to happen anymore. These are countries where there's going to be open debate about foreign policy, and the Israelis want to be on the right side of that, and they're not taking the right steps, and we are not helping them take those steps. We are allowing them to drift, and I think that's not in our interests, and it's certainly not in the Israelis' interests, though they might differ. I'm sure they would. I want to go to questions at some point soon, because I really would like to have a conversation. I think this is important because it's the point of the book. I want to try to stimulate some thought outside the box a little bit about these things, because it's very easy for us to chug along in the comfortable wake of the Cold War and the period of the 90s and early 2000s when we were really hegemonistic. We were hugely overpowering as an economy and as a cultural power in the world and as a military power. I think we need to start thinking outside those lines a little bit. I hope that I've laid out some ideas in the book that will help foreign policymakers think through some of these issues. But none of it is possible unless we get our act together at home. And this is a depressing story. It really is. The United States is currently being governed by two parties, one of which is at war with itself. And that's obviously the Republican Party. The Republican Party is in the midst of an unfinished civil war, which I believe can only be solved by electoral defeat, because I'm a big believer in the fact that failure is a great teacher. I've done it myself. I don't believe that the Tea Party faction within the Republican Party is an electable party at the national level. I think that they will ultimately fail. It is not the direction that the mainstream in this country wants to go. It is a minority play akin to, I always like to think of this as the Roger Ailes school of political thought. There is 30% of the country who will always come to Fox News, always. But to make that bigger and to make that bigger is very difficult, because in some ways you're being exclusionary just by catering to that 38%. And I think that's the same. It's a very similar problem that the Tea Party is having now, is that their appeal is to a very specific portion of this country. That's not to say they haven't played some good roles in the last, I guess you could say, about four years since they came onto the national radar. Similarly, on the left, the Move On / Occupy movement has also played a role in that it is giving voice to this middle class that has really reached a kind of boiling frog moment. The middle class in this country, after the 2008 crisis, seems to have come to terms with the fact that since 1968 or so, its per capita income, its discretionary income has gone nowhere. In fact, it's gone down. While if you take the 20% below them and the 20% at the top of our economy, they've each improved. That is a real source of anger right now in the election. It's a real source of anger right now in both political parties, and both political parties are having a great deal of trouble managing that anger, because neither of them are any longer populist. At least their establishments are not populist. They're not able to channel that in productive ways. So you're seeing these parties fray at the edges, much more so in the Republican Party, though. I think that I want to end this portion before we go to questions on a little bit of, I'm supposed to be somebody who forecasts things, so I'm going to do a little forecasting. I'll put myself on the record. I think Romney has no chance of winning the next election. I think, now, I'm being analytical. I think at this stage, for him not to have had the handshake with his own party that he needs to have to start moving to the center is a disaster for him. And having said that, Romney himself, I believe, is a much more moderate man than he's been able to present. But his biography is the biography of somebody that's exactly in the wrong election cycle. This is an election filled with angry middle-class voters. The last thing they want to see is a guy from Wall Street, frankly. He, to me, is going to be overly reliant on activating the dislike that the 38 to 40% of the country on the right really has for Obama, and that's going to prevent him from making the tack that he needs to make to win the independence. Now, having said that, there are risks for Obama. If the economy does another summer swoon, and there's precedent, the last two summers we've seen it have a little nice spring and then swoon in the summer again, that could cause problems for him. If it doesn't, I think he's home free. If the Iranian-Israeli clash happens and it's mishandled by the United States, then I think similarly he's in trouble. But I also think that that's overdone. I actually think the Israelis are very cleverly, and this is where I think they're getting it right, warning of their imminent attack precisely because they know that that's the only way you can get the Iranians to take anything seriously. And so these talks we're having may actually produce some kind of a concession on the Iranian side. One of the other reasons I don't think that's going to happen right away is because 2 out of the 3 parties don't want it to happen. The Iranians, clearly, they can, even if they aren't genuine, which is quite possible, they can string out these talks for a while by appearing genuine. And the U.S., establishment does not want this to happen, neither the military nor the administration. And I don't believe the Israeli military or the Israeli intelligence agencies believe that a strike against Iran will ultimately do any good. In fact, it might actually do the opposite of good. It would rally the country around the regime and cause the Iranian program to go into high gear. It would set them back for a few years. That's it. So oil prices really are the risk for Obama there. But I think a lot of that is already booked into markets right now. There is no good reason. The Saudi oil minister said this a few weeks ago, and he's right. There's no good reason in terms of market forces that oil prices should be so high right now. Most economies are not performing at anywhere near their peaks. There's more oil coming onto the market than ever before. So it's got to be a political risk issue, mostly about Iran. And so the spike would certainly happen if the Israelis and the Iranians went at it. But I don't believe the spike will be as dramatic as some fear. And possibly not as sustained either. I don't believe the Iranians have the ability to shut the Straits of Hormuz with the U.S. Navy there. So now, to end on a nice thought. You know, I worked for Nouriel Roubini for several years during that crisis. Actually, it was an amazing time to watch this man work. He's quite an interesting thinker. If you don't know who he is, he was one of several people who really kind of got it right before the crisis. Here's what's going to happen. He had a 10-point thing, and I think 9 of the points happened to a T. It was scary. But one of the things that I learned working with him is that you have to mitigate your predictions, and you have to do scenarios. You cannot just say, here's what's going to happen. So the scenario that I see on the upside for the United States right now is that China is changing in ways that we, as I said earlier, often don't seem to understand and often put the worst possible spin on. One of the things, other than the microblogs, which are a fascinating look into China, there's a lot of passion for democracy in China. But beyond that, another thing that's changing in China dramatically is there is a real change in the cost of doing business in China for multinationals that put big plants there, that assemble or produce in China anything with value beyond the raw materials of, beyond the really heavy industry of steel and rote production of consumer goods. Chinese workers are demanding pay. Chinese workers are demanding labor laws. Chinese workers want time off. Chinese workers want loans from the bank. Chinese workers want environmental laws. These things are kicking in, and it's costing Chinese companies and American companies and European companies and others that have put their production facilities there a lot more money now. The gap between producing a lot of products in the United States or Europe, if you're going to sell them there, has dramatically changed in the last 5 years. Part of that is the recession. Part of that is global energy costs, because you have to get something produced in China back here, and that costs more than it did 5 years ago. But there's a genuine change in that relationship. Now, the pessimists would say, okay, but there's always Vietnam and Bangladesh. Well, yeah, there's always going to be. But remember the giant sucking sound that Mexico was going to cause, right? No one worries about that anymore. In fact, Mexico has suffered more than most in this recession because they're so closely tied to us. Ultimately, we are the country that innovates. We are the factory of innovation. Flat on our back in the last 3 years, we have introduced several products that literally revolutionized the world. The iPad, Twitter, Facebook, the iPhone. These are not minor incremental improvements in existing product lines. These were really revolutionary products that came out of an economy in deep recession. China has not one global brand that can compete with the great brands of the world. They will get there, but they are not producing innovative inventions that change the world. They are assembling innovative inventions that change the world, and that may not last forever. I don't think we should look them at this point as a pure competitor, because you will get what you ask for if you do that. It will feed those within China that fear us as much as we fear them. I don't think we need to be there as a country, and I don't think we need to be there as an economy. Our economic problems are very much of our own making. We followed a very faith-based form of economics over the past 15 years, and it blew up in our face in 2008. We haven't fully exercised those ghosts. I think we need to. And we need to realize that what we're good at needs investment. We are good at science. We are good at high-end engineering. We can produce things in this country as well as anybody if we choose the right things to produce. Aerospace, certain aspects of the automotive industry, perhaps not the big chassis assembly lines for a long time, but there are things we can build here better than anyone, and we should be investing in the educational system that provides those products and in the companies that make them. Well, I hope you'll buy the book, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
I like very much your analysis of Europe and the Middle East, but I'm a little troubled by some of your analysis on Asia. I would argue that the U.S. is playing its role about right in Asia right now, and that we do need to keep some troops in both South Korea and Japan. If we didn't have troops there, both South Korea and Japan would go nuclear. and it would raise the temperature a lot and frighten China. I would also argue that China has been more aggressive in the last couple of years than it had been before in the South China Sea. The presence of the U.S. Navy is very important in East and Southeast Asia. The countries don't go out of their way to say they want us there. They really do want us there, and we're playing a very important role.
I would argue that you're right about the strong presence. I just would argue that we are not asking our allies to carry their weight. The Seventh Fleet is clearly the key to the balanced power in the region. Even the Chinese occasionally accidentally nod in that direction when describing the potential for, as you say, Japan or other countries to go nuclear. But there's no reason Japan cannot contribute more to its own defense, and there's no reason South Korea should not be contributing more to its own defense. These are G20 nations, in Japan's cases, third largest economy in the world. They have proven for generations that they're not about to reinvade Manchuria. China uses the historical enmity between both Japan and Korea and Japan in itself as a battering ram to keep the Japanese domestic debate pacified, so to speak. This is in its interests, but that also means that we have to pay for it. I think there's a better way to do that. I think there is a conversation to be had with both Korea and Japan that doesn't lead to nuclearization. I mean, the Chinese know that Japan's a plug-and-play nuclear power if it really wanted to. They have the capability, the technical capability. Nobody knows that they can actually do it in a week or a month, but give them 3 months and I'm sure they could do it. Obviously, the taboos are enormous, but you know, they showed some inclination in the late 90s when the North Koreans lobbed a missile over the Sea of Japan and over their Northern Ireland. Ooh, there's a Freudian slip from an Irishman. Over their Northern Island. And then, in essence, what you saw after that was a public debate over whether Japan should have nuclear weapons, which was fairly shocking at the time. It didn't go anywhere, but it was a first-time debate. I don't think they should. I don't think they need it. The Seventh Fleet is awesome. It is vastly superior to anything the Chinese have. The Chinese Blue Water Navy, I'm not convinced. They have a former Soviet Hulk that's floating around, you know, with very little capabilities and less capability to actually operate it. They're just learning how to do it. They've got some submarines that are legitimately blue water, but the rest of their surface fleet is not. And they have, if you look at militarily, what would China need to be able to do? Well, if you were the person who was supposed to defend China, you would want to be able to push the American fleet out as far as you could so that they couldn't bomb your mainland. That is essentially the weapon systems that they've built. They've not really gone beyond it. And one really interesting indication of their not being overly aggressive is that their nuclear forces have been pretty static in the last 20 years. They haven't got engaged in an enormous buildup of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Even their nuclear submarines tend to be attack submarines and not nuclear missile submarines. So, I mean, I tend to think of them as they want to be disruptive. They want to be able to take our satellites down. They want to be able to prevent us from attacking. I just don't see, you know, now there's Taiwan again, and I think I went on probably too long about Taiwan, but I believe that should be something that is a little more actively in the diplomatic dialogue now. The kind of Cold War status quo there is crumbling. Taiwan even sees it. We should be engaged in that instead of standing on the sidelines and pretending that everything's the same way it was in 1980 when we signed our diplomatic, when we exchanged ambassadors. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the informative presentation. Very interesting, and I happen to agree with your overall foreign policy views. My question is about the domestic economy. Could you please comment about the prospects for resolving the problem of the deficits, the annual deficits being over $1 trillion a year, the excessive debt formation at all levels of the economy, the household, state, federal government, the paralysis between the two parties? Will the sequestration take effect, and what implication will that have for the domestic economy and for foreign policy? If we need to reduce the military by $500 billion, obviously it's going to weaken our presence and eliminate some of the bases that you mentioned. All this depends on one thing. The root cause of the problem is the deficits, and I'm sure with your affiliation with Mariel
Rubini.
Rubini,
Yeah.
Thank you. You have a lot of insights and expertise in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. You know, our ability to project power and influence in the world is absolutely dependent on the proper running of our economy, and we have not run it very well in recent years. This is, by and large, though, not an economic problem. I know that sounds silly. Our problem is political in this country right now. We have a very enviable economy, an economy that's capable of growing at a moderately fast pace, certainly a huge pace for an economy of this size. Certainly not 4% a year. That's a dream. You know, this is a mature, developed economy. But 2%, 2.5% a year, given what we've just been through, which is akin to an economic heart attack, for the next decade or so, puts us on a decent path toward sustainable fiscal realities. That said, as I said, politics is the speed bump for us. We have one party that is not willing to engage in the conversation in any sense. And I know that sounds partisan, but think this. Last year, during the theater of the absurd that was the debt ceiling debate, the president of the Democratic Party and of the United States put Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security on the table. This was the culmination of 60 years of Republican demand. Republicans have said since FDR passed and Lyndon Johnson augmented these policies that they were unsustainable and ultimately would pervert our economy and become a serious problem. Instead of grabbing that statement with both hands and saying we were right for 50 years, the Republicans couldn't even bring the votes to the table to have a real conversation about it. They cannot control their own caucus. This is rejectionism. This doesn't help anybody, at least of all, really, the Republican Party. They'd have something to run on this year if they had been part of this grand bargain. That would have been a victory for the Republican Party in any way you look at it historically. That's what the problem is. We don't have two parties right now. We have at least three, possibly four, but in our system, they are in two coalitions. So you've got one side that is simply not coming to the table. Now, could Obama have demonstrated more tactical skill? Yes. Could he have perhaps been a little tougher? Yes, absolutely. I think the deal he cut at New Year in 2011 was, you know, a very weak deal and did not, over the Bush tax cuts, and essentially relenting and then getting nothing back. I mean, he's had a habit of doing that. And it's hard to imagine that he's not being badly advised, frankly. But given what he was presented at the beginning of his administration, remember, a lot of people like to say, oh, it's the worst thing that any president's faced since FDR. Well, FDR knew there was a depression when he was running for president. I mean, Obama, it literally occurred to everyone, except my boss, somewhere between his election and his inauguration that there was practically a depression. And he was essentially beholden to the Republican Party's solution to it, which was the TARP. Now, I think he could have done a lot better with TARP. This sounds crazy, but what I would have done is if you're going to direct the money at the banks, channel it through people who put it into to paying down their mortgages, and suddenly you don't have the housing crisis that you have today. You have equity in housing. It's astounding that they just gave it away and then continue to lend. That's a hard thing to defend, except that the other better ideas would have left a lot of political blood on the doorstep, and would have made him a redistributive president from the moment he got into office, which I don't think the Democratic Party wanted. They weren't ready to be that. In retrospect, they may regret it now because they don't really have that. They don't have claim to having saved the world. You know, they'd like to be able to say that, but no one likes the way it happened, and it taints it. So I think our problems are largely political. Here's another way to look at this. The G7, the old economies, the West and Japan, the BRICS, we all know what the BRICS are by now, and this other tier, which I love, the amidst economies. This is Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, just as, in many ways, even more interesting economies than the BRICS because they have fewer of the actual flaws. All of these economies have deep internal contradictions. They have very large, most of them have very large, nearly destitute populations, and they have a real income disparity issue and demographic time bombs sewn into many of them. China, for instance, with its one-child policy, is going to hit a real wall in terms of the number of people working versus the number of people on pension, and that's going to happen soon. India has perverted its demographics with ultrasound abortion. That's going to be similar. The Germans, the Europeans are aging in an unfriendly way for their economies. The Japanese are the worst of all. They are going to have a very low worker to pensioner relationship, and that's going to be a very difficult problem to solve. The United States is the golden boy in that group. I mean, we're in good shape. We actually have, by virtue of the fact that we have a relatively high population growth rate, and the fact that we still allow immigration in very large numbers, and seem to actually have learned how to control it a little more, that's a good story. That's a good news story for this country. So I believe that our politics in the United States does contain the seeds of solutions. We are 2 or 3 backroom conversations between mature political figures in both parties to solving some of these problems. You take Medicaid, Social Security, you means test some of it. You tell people who were born before 65 they get a certain amount, people after 75 get a different amount. You just have to. It's not sustainable. The Republicans are right about that. But not allowing us to solve it is really stupid. And it's really going to come back to haunt them, I think.
So what will break the logjam?
As I said, failure is a wonderful teacher. I think they will fail at the polls repeatedly. And this is what happens to parties who go into extended periods in the wilderness. In many ways, you can trace some of what's wrong with the American political debate to the first period of wilderness the Republicans suffered, beginning with FDR, ending really with Nixon, because I put Eisenhower in a kind of nonpartisan world. But even when Nixon finally won, what was he? He was the ultimate anti-intellectual, hated the intellectuals of the East Coast, even though he himself had gone to Harvard. That was by then boiled into the DNA of the Republican bone. And it's out of control now with the Tea Party, and they have to get it under control, or else they will lose successive elections at the national level, I think.
Could you comment on the student loan bubble and the education, and what's this proper balance in that?
You know, this is something I spent quite a bit of time writing about in the book, because as I looked more deeply into it, I realized I didn't have a full appreciation for the extent to which student loans had become commodities, just like, you know, mortgage-backed securities. That it is essentially these things had become you could really get trapped now in a way that wasn't true before. Kids in the United States are always debt burdened. That's been our system, and I was as a young man as well. I came out of college with a great deal of debt, but I had no real fear that I would not be able to pay it off, and the penalties were different for asking for holidays, and there were reasons you could defer. That's changed. It's become a real business now, and I do believe people got fleeced pretty seriously over the last 10 years. I don't think it has prevented people from going to university, though, and here's where the real learning curve for me kicked in. I think one of the things that we have to examine in the U.S. is the extent to which we're educating our students in useful things, because it's becoming a luxury, really, to get out of a university now with a degree that's fairly vague and not applicable to your career, and expect that in a world where 3 billion people have joined the capitalist market since the fall of the Berlin Wall, you're not going to face some pretty tough competition. Not every job, of course, is subject to the pressures of overseas labor competition. You can't, a plumber, for instance, you can't outsource, thank God, a plumber. But if you are, shooting for a career in something like engineering, something that touches on manufacturing and certain services, even the financial industry. It's becoming very clear that you have to start thinking very early about the practicalities of this. Don't be taking on all this debt. I hate to say this because it runs against everything I was really brought up with, but I think philosophy degrees that cost $100,000 are really now the preserve of the wealthy. That it's a sad place that we are right now, but it is a very difficult situation that the United States has gotten itself into. On the one hand, we have a payee system in our universities. On the other hand, we have a university system that was very utopian and was really geared toward people moving into the liberal arts. And that liberal arts, those liberal arts degrees, if you look now at what people are studying, are diminishing. And there's a good reason for it, because it's being shown to these students very early on, as it never was before, that, well, you can do that, but you might not be able to pay your loans when you get out, or you may not be able to get a job. And now there's exceptions to this. There's still people who will go into the law for which the liberal arts degree is a really good initial foundation. There's still people who go into social work, and there's, the initial pay for a social work is surprisingly high if you can get the job. That just doesn't go up very quickly. But by and large, I think our system now, and I believe parents now, should be adjusting in such a way that it becomes a little more practical. And I think we're seeing a shift that I would suggest means we should learn a little bit from the Germans and from some of the countries that have very strong, powerful vocational systems, where the idea that we will have no place for artists and writers, that's just not true. We will, of course. The problem is we have a system that only educates people at an elite level, and we don't really have a very, very cogent system. We have certainly no national system for vocational trades. And you get a kind of a smattering of that in school, and then you're thrown into the private market. And these days, the cost of training somebody is just another reason to move the job overseas for some of these companies. So I would like to see us learn a bit from that. The Germans do it quite well. It's an amazing economy when you think about it. Again, they have their issues coming up with demography, but there comes a point in everybody's career as a student in Germany where they have to make a little choice, and it's partly going to be driven by what they're competent in, which is an anathema thing here, I realize. But if you can't pass certain tests, you're not going to the university. You're going to go to a vocational school. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing, I don't think. Well, I've been given the indication that that's it. And I want to thank everybody. Thank you for being patient. And I urge you, if you have the appetite, to read more in The Reckoning.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.